Hi, TubeDude here. Glad you could join me on my trip down memory lane in a float tube. I sure had fun over the years putting it together and doing all the fishing. Somebody's got to do it, right? Did I really spend 60 years in a float tube? Well, obviously not all in one trip. My poor old bladder had never put up with that. Just a few hours out in the float tube and I've got to hit the shoreline and do a download. So I did, however, was one of the early pioneers of float tubing, going back to the late 1950s and early 1960s. I was in my early teen years in those days, and I was going out fishing in an inner tube. Did well enough that I stuck with it and added seats and covers over the years. Now, that was in my early teen years, and I'm 78 now, so somewhere in there there's 60 years with a float tubing experience. The one big regret I have is that in those years I really wasn't taking it seriously. It was kind of a novelty, and I had no idea how long it was going to last or how big it was going to become. And I didn't have a camera, so I didn't get a lot of pictures and documentation on some of my early attempts in float tubes. But thankfully, by the time I started buying and using the commercial float tubes and pontoons, which was about 1978, I did have a camera, and I was doing a lot more photo documentation on my fishing trips. And of course that included the float tubes that I used, the places that I went fishing, and the fish species that I caught. And over the years I've caught over 100 species out of a float tube, so been modestly successful from that standpoint. Now, when I decided to put this together for anybody that might be interested in a career in float tubing, the big choice was which pictures do I use and which ones do I leave, because it'd be real easy to overdo something like this. But what I end up with, since I only recently got a video camera, is it's going to be a video slideshow more than action-packed video of fishing scenes. So hope you're okay with that, and hope there's enough fish porn in the mix to at least keep your interest up. And thanks for watching. I got started early. As a kid in Idaho, I tromped the banks of a little stream that ran by our house in Idaho Falls, and eventually emptied into the Snake River. Caught lots of nice trout out of it. Caught a few suckers and chubs too. But that made me a forever fisherman. I've been irretrievably hooked ever since. Now here I am 70 years later, diehard float tube fisherman, retired, living in Utah. Just still having a good time. My wife has been with me in the float tube for the last 40 years. She's got her own outfit. She's a pretty darn good fisherman, and sometimes she even lets me catch the biggest or the most fish, but not always. We raised our kids right. This is my number one son, Mike. A little lake down in Arizona. A couple of nice catfish and a couple of small bass that he caught on a trip with us down there. My number two son, Steve, he's also put his son in a float tube, and here we are, 3 generations, all in a float tube group on Saguaro Lake in Arizona. Float tube history, before about 1970, there wasn't much of an alternative to boats, and people started going out in inner tubes, figuring that would be a good, inexpensive way to get out where the fish were biting, away from shore. Up in the Pacific Northwest, it was the fly flingers that were out after the trout that were rising beyond their longest cast. And in the South States and the Midwest, where there were a lot of farm ponds and stock tanks, good old boys got in their float tubes and went out and fished for bass and catfish and panfish. And the good news was it worked pretty well. So it did develop, but there was no single individual that invented float tubes and made $1 million by patenting it. Some of the early model float tubes were kind of laughable by today's standards, but they worked. You get out on the water, you catch more fish than if you fish off the shore a lot of times. One of the first commercially available float tubes was the Fish and Float. Not much more than a cover around an inner tube with seat and shoulder straps, but it did work, got the job done. My personal history is I kind of did it backwards for most people. I started fishing out of an inner tube in saltwater and eventually expanded to freshwater. And during the course of over 15 to 20 years, experimented around a lot with different kinds of seats and covers. Never did really get anything fantastic or fancy. And it always was more of a novelty than a serious fishing system, but I did catch a lot of fish. Since I didn't have a camera in the early years, I didn't get many pictures of my early stuff, but this shows you what my first float tube looked like. It was me sitting down inside the float tube, butt first, legs over the side with a pair of swim fins, and kicking around the fins and sculling with my hands, but did catch fish. Since then, I've gone through just about every make and model of float tube and a lot of the pontoons that they've come out with commercially. Probably had over 30 different models over the course of the last 40 years, starting out with the Fishmaster, which was my first one that I got in Utah, and going through the Insel Dry, the Ray Scott, Browning, had several of the Caddis and several of the Fat Cat over the years. They were pretty good tunes and served me well. And during all that time, since I'm kind of the creative kind of guy and handy with tools, I came up with a lot of different innovations in rod holders, utility tool racks, sonar installations, motor mounts. I'm affectionately known as the Prince of PVC for a lot of the stuff that I made out of that stuff. Again, my first commercially purchased float tube was a Fishmaster made by a company down in Oklahoma. And it was light years ahead of anything that I've been making for myself. Had a nice plastic covered fabric seat, had pockets, had a nice seat, had an apron and everything else in it, and it held me up pretty well. Even though it was only a 20-inch inner tube in there, it still floated me pretty well. And just had to get another one for my wife because she wanted to get involved, so she's been float tubing with me ever since. A second commercially purchased float tube was the Insel Dry. Great float tube, got a lot of use out of it, used it all over the country, but Insel Dry came out during a time when there really wasn't a lot of demand yet for float tubes, and they didn't sell enough of them to make it profitable, so that was the only model that they ever brought out. Same thing happened with the Ray Scott company. This was my next commercially purchased float tube. And while I dearly loved it, used it all over the country, they never brought out any other models, and that was it. My next model was the Browning Big Guy. Instead of a 20-inch inner tube, it took the 22-inch inner tube, which gave me a little bit more flotation, and I enjoyed the heck out of that. And same with the next item, which is a Buck's Bag Giant model. That also took the 22-inch float tube. Now you notice some of the evolution going on here in the rod holders, and also notice a little motorcycle battery over there to power my first attempt at attaching a sonar. Got into the Caddis line of float tubes while we lived in Arizona. Actually had several different models that we bought and used and enjoyed. They were a price line. They were substantially lower in price than a lot of the other float tubes, but they were made very well. And as you can see, we did catch some fish out of them. This is the red model. I think it was called a Nevada. I'm not sure what the other ones were called. This is the brown cover caddis, but it's good enough for catching crappie and white bass. And this is the green model caddis, which I kind of like probably better than the others. It seemed to be a little cut a little bit fuller. It floated me a little bit better. This is down in Louisiana. That's a speckled sea trout on the apron part there. You notice some more evolution in the PVC rod tubes. Our first non-inner tube float tube was the Kennebec, brought out by Trout Unlimited. It was lighter weight because it didn't have the heavy rubber inner tube, and it was very comfortable, but we weren't really keen on the metal stabilizer bar that went across the front of it, and we also didn't like the way it handled in the wind. It had a high profile, and when the wind came up, it was really hard to maintain tracking a straight line with kicking your fins. One of the last float tubes we bought while we lived in Arizona was the outcast fat cat. These were considered the Cadillacs of the float tube industry at that time, and are still held in high regard. And over the last 20 years, I think we've probably gone through a half a dozen of them, not because they're cheap, we just wear them out. I did try fishing out of a pontoon a couple of times. This is one I bought. It's a Fish Cat Cougar, and I liked it for the idea of the low profile. It has twin air chambers on either side and rides low in the water, so it didn't catch the air quite as much when it's breezy. And it was a great fishing platform. I really enjoyed it, but the one thing I never did get used to and never did like was having to use the oars to maintain position. I much prefer to do hands-free maintaining and using just the fins. Next step up from that was a Dave Skadden Outlaw Renegade, and this is kind of a hybrid between a frame pontoon and a big float tube. And like this one, put a motor on it to get from point A to point B. Even though it had oars on it, I never used the oars, but I did use the fins all day long for keeping myself positioned. And just because it was bigger than a float tube, it about beat me to death on a long day on the water. Another step was the Dave Skadden Freestyle H3. This was his answer to the Outcast Fat Cat, which he had also helped design a few years earlier. And it was a great fishing craft. The only problem was I had cut corners and got his inflatable seat cushions from China. And after a short time on the water, the seams in them disintegrated, and the seat swelled up and became a big basketball instead of a nice comfy corrugated seat. But he honored his warranty, and we did get out of them okay. For the past few years, I've been fishing in the Dave Skadden Escape, and this is just about everything I need. It's got very high flotation. It takes my battery and my motor and all the other stuff I put on it, and still floats me high out of the water, and I can kick it around all day in the fins without killing myself. I've really enjoyed it. Got it all tricked out like a mini bass boat. I get back into the ramp and everybody goes ooh ah, and I just say, hey, hold on there. I can't tow a water skier with it, but I can fish pretty good with it. Now let's talk about the first three models that I owned: the Fishmaster, Insel Dry, and Ray Scott. These are during my early years in Utah. I bought the Fishmaster in 1978. We moved to Arizona in 1984, so this is that period of time. We've talked about the Fishmaster. It was head and shoulders above anything else on the market at the time, but it's rude and crude by today's standards, although it was good enough to help me catch a big bunch of bluegill on a fly rod. This was supposed to be a gag picture with me holding a walleye in one hand and a bugle mouth bass in the other, but it makes a pretty good example for the Fishmaster, showing the early use of the PVC rod tubes, and the fact that even though it was only a 20-inch inner tube, it floated me very well, even though I'm well over 200 pounds. Here I am in the Fishmaster in Willard Bay, South Marina, with a string of crappies I caught on a fly rod. My next commercially purchased float tube was the Insel Dry, which I've talked about, and this is Willard Bay Reservoir near the South Marina along the dike. That's an average size walleye and an average size catfish for 1982. Now the average size has gone down substantially in the last few years. Okay, notice again the PVC rod tubes and the addition of hanging a fish basket over one of them on the front. This is down at Yuba Reservoir in central Utah, and this is the Insel Dry also. Shows a small northern pike and some pretty hefty yellow perch going up to about 14-15 inches. Yuba used to really put out some big perch. Here's the Insel Dry on Willard Bay Reservoir after an evening of fishing, throwing plastics around the shoreline. That's about a 6-pound walleye and about a 9-pound catfish, so wasn't a bad trip. Here's the Ray Scott again. I don't have a lot of pictures of the Ray Scott for some reason, although I fished with it all over the country. This shows a limit of 6 walleye that I culled from about 20 that I caught that day. Utah Lake used to put out a lot more walleye than it does today. A little more about the history of flotation fishing, I call it. For a long time, float tubes were a pretty big market. You saw a lot of them on the water wherever you went, float tubes and pontoons. But today you're seeing fewer of them, and the main reason is because there's so many other different options. One of those is a kayak. Several manufacturers have come out with specially made fishing kayaks that are just really fantastic. However, they're pretty spendy, so if you don't want to spend that much money, you can buy a bare bones kayak and trick it out the way you want it. One of the interesting new innovations has been the stand-up paddle boards. I can't really see one for my own use, but some guys use them and like them and catch fish out of them. The bad thing is they're only good for small lakes and quiet waters. You get out where the power squadron's churning up the water, or get on a big lake or out in the ocean, you're going to have some stability problems. For that, you're going to need a jet ski that's tricked out for fishing. And there are several manufacturers that are making those these days. You see a lot more of them out in the ocean for inshore fishing, and you're also seeing quite a few of them on big lakes like Lake Powell, because you can launch and head up the lake for a long ways, make a long run, go fishing, and be back in a timely fashion. But these things are really spendy, and if you can't quite afford that amount of money, then you can make your own with a slab of styrofoam and a lawn chair, or if you really need to scale down, go into a redneck bass boat. Okay, let's talk about the middle years of my float tubing career, the 20 years between 1984 and 2004. This is the time during which I lived in Arizona, but spent time in Louisiana and down in the Sea of Cortez in Mexico. And accordingly, this segment will be broken up to 3 parts. And I'll also talk about the different float tubes that we used during this period of time: the red, brown, and green caddis, the browning, the buck's bag, Kennebecs, Outcast Fat Cat, and so forth. One of the first little lakes that we discovered after moving to Tucson was Peña Blanca Lake, which is down near Nogales on the Mexico border. And it's a little natural lake, didn't get a lot of boat traffic, so it was ideal for float tubing. Also, with the natural shoreline cover of cattails and reeds, it was just great for sunfish and a lot of nice crappie. A lot of bass and catfish too if you wanted to fish for them. We fished mostly for the nice crappie like this one. Caught a lot of that crappie and nice bluegill. Calling your attention to the naugahyde apron on TubeDude's race caught tube. The naugahyde was to prevent the spines from sunfish and crappie from going through the top of the tube when they bounced off when we were trying to bring them up over the edge. When you get in a hot school and catching a lot of fish, it's inevitable some of them are going to drop off the hook and bounce off the end of your float tube, and it's just kind of ruins your day when you got to go back in because you got a pinhole leak in your tube. Another place we fished a lot out of Phoenix was up below Horseshoe Dam on the Verde River. That was a lake that held a lot of fish, was good fishing, and a lot of fish came through the spillway down into the spill hole below. Also, a lot of them came up from Bartlett Lake down below on the Verde River. So there's almost always some good bass, crappie, bluegill, and both channel cat and flathead cats in there, so we had a lot of fun with all of them. This is a nice flathead cat that TubeDude caught out of a red caddis. Here's a little bit bigger one that I caught fishing out of my red caddis, along with a few nice crappie I caught on that day. This is about a 20-pound plus flathead cat. We kept almost all the ones we caught because they're extremely good eating, even in the larger sizes. This is a channel cat TubeDude caught down at Parker Canyon Lake, which we loved to fish, but it was a little longer distance, so we didn't fish it as often. Nice string of sunfish on the left, and that cat thought he had flossed his teeth with their little jig she was using for the sunfish, and put up a pretty good account of himself before she got it to crawl in the net. Lake Pleasant was a lake just to the north of Phoenix. It's one of the bigger lakes we fished. It wasn't a natural lake. It's It's got a dam on it, and it's filled every year from the Central Arizona project, water coming in from the Colorado River. And so it fills up in the winter, and then it's drained in the summer to water all the cotton in the area. About a 50-60 foot drop every year, but still good fishing. The only problem was we a lot of times had to park up on the road and then fight our way down through the brush to launch our float tubes. And everything down there has stickers, so it wasn't uncommon to drop your tube in the water and see a stream of air bubbles coming out underneath, and that kind of shortens the day up a little bit. This is me and my fat cat on Lake Pleasant, and those are a couple of average sized white bass down there. They average about 1.5 to 1.5 pounds. They get up to 3 or 4 pounds, and when they get that size, they're like small wipers. A lot of fun. Notice the horizontal rod rack. That was one of the reasons I chose this picture to show. I used that for a short time, but I decided I liked the vertical rudder, so I went back to that. Here's a picture from Lake Pleasant and the brown caddis. Good mix of nice crappie and white bass. This is the red caddis on Lake Pleasant. That's about a 6-pound largemouth. That'd raise eyes in most states, but not in Arizona, because Arizona grows them up to 18 pounds, and a lot of them. So Arizona's a good bass state. One of our favorite lakes down below Tucson was Patagonia Lake. This is another little natural lake down near the Mexico border. And again, as a natural lake, there are a lot of cattails and reeds around the shoreline, and a lot of little coves where float tube fishermen could tuck away and fish all day and have a good time. We enjoyed what we call dipsticking, which is using a long rod and just kicking the float tube along and dipping our jigs down beside the reeds and seeing what would come out and take a bite. Now, on any given day, you never know what fish you're going to catch. Here's a day where we kept a mixture of nice crappies and about 4 species of sunfish, including bluegill, red ear sunfish, and green sunfish. And also a little catfish in there that decided to play. Anytime the big cats chomped on our rods next to the reeds, we usually lost those because they'd go back in and tie a couple of granny knots and it'd be all over. Lots of nice crappie in Patagonia. This is string included about 12 to 14 inches on average. They got a lot bigger in Patagonia. These are some 16 to 18 inches. We got them up to 20 inches in the spring when they were in spawning and around the reeds, and we could do the dipstick routine. This is about a 2-pound red ear sunfish. They get a lot bigger than bluegills, and they're a lot of fun. Good eating, too. Saguaro Lake was one of our favorite lakes when we lived in Phoenix. It was east of Phoenix on the Salt River. There are actually several different reservoirs along the Salt River that could be fished, but this was especially float tube friendly because it had a lot of coves like this one that, as you can see by the buoy, was buoyed off to fast boat traffic, so we could fish back there without being overrun with water skiers. Standard catch down there usually included a lot of yellow bass. They're like white bass. They got the yellow coloration, but like white bass, they school up in large schools and they're easy to catch a bunch once you find them. Here's the his and hers kennebecks coming into shore on Saguaro Lake, along with a mixed bag of probably 4 or 5 species in the fish basket. Here's a tube babe with a nice catfish she caught out of her kennebec. Here's me with a little smaller catfish. I happened to let her catch the biggest one that day. Nice guy that I am. Here I am loading up the float tube for trudging back to the car. And the kennebecks, because they have the lightweight vinyl air chambers, are a lot easier to carry than the big round float tubes that have the truck tire inner tubes in them. One of the last tubes that we bought while living in Arizona was the Outcast Fat Cat. Super good float tube. We've gone through several of them over the years. And again, this is about a standard catch out of saguaro in those days, which included yellow bass and catfish. Well, this concludes the Arizona portion of the last 20 years. Next, we'll go on to Mexico. Okay, Viva Mexico! This is the last portion of the middle 20 years of my float tubing career. Going to be down in Mexico. Now, if you head south from Tucson, Puerto Penasco is about 4 hours in one direction. Puerto Lobos is about 5 hours. And San Carlos is about 5.5 hours. San Carlos is down by Guaymas, for those that are more familiar with that area. Start with Puerto Penasco. This is where all the rowdy gringos from Tucson and Phoenix go on the weekend to let off steam, build their little cabins out there and go down and drink and set off fireworks. Only trouble is about Memorial Day every year, they desert the place because it gets hotter than heck down there. But great for float tubing because you're sitting out in the water. And real easy to drive down on hard-packed sand and launch right at the water's edge. Notice the high water mark right next to the tire. Good fishing either from the beach or from the rocks down there. This is Tube Babe with our Browning float tube and our Ray Scott float tube. And a few fish that we've caught, one of the local boys helping us shuffle and rearrange them. This is kind of a mix that we scattered out there, consists of several different species, but one of the most prominent is the spotted bay bass. They're the most common fish down there, and very aggressive, very easy to catch, a lot of fun, good eating. One thing you don't want to catch a lot of down there is these needlefish. They're a lot of fun and they jump and cavort and all that kind of thing, but you don't want to get them anywhere near your tube because they can do some damage to either you or your tube. And with those teeth, they chew up the lures really good. It's hard to bring in a plastic sometimes without it getting shredded. Here's the Buck's Bag Giant with some triggerfish. Triggerfish are so called because the front spine locks in place, but the spine right behind it, you can depress that and it folds everything up. Triggerfish are a lot of fun to catch. They fight hard. They're really, really good eating. Orange-mouthed corvina down there is also a lot of fun to catch and very good eating. And they're very aggressive. You find a school of them, you can catch a lot and have a lot of fun. Puerto Lobos is about the midway down the Sea of Cortez to where we go. At the end of 30 miles of bad road, see the washboards, rattle the fillings out of your teeth the last few miles before you get there. Once you get there, there's miles of nice sand beach. You can either drive up and camp up at the other end, or you can camp under one of these palapas. You don't need the thatched roof to keep the rain off, but you do need it to keep the sun off. It gets hotter than heck down there during the daytime. Here we are camped on the beach farther up next to the sand dunes. That was kind of a neat place to park. Most of the time the water's pretty calm down there. It's more like a lake than an ocean. But the wind does blow once in a while, and made an interesting picture with the Puerto Lobos lighthouse in the background. Most of the time the water's pretty calm like you see here. You see Puerto Lobos fishing village over along the beach area to the left. And it's two Mexican shrimp boats anchored during the daytime. The fishermen sleep during the daytime. Then they go out at night and fish for those big Gulf shrimp out there. When they come back in, if you talk nice, you can get a great big bag of them for about $5 and have your heck of a beach dinner. Again, this is the beach where the Mexicans go out fishing every day, Puerto Lobos. This is the Panga fleet. Pangas are the names of the boats that they use. They're very hardy and can handle some pretty rough water for small boats. This is Metropolitan Puerto Lobos. And I'm guessing that's probably the Walmart in the middle there. As I said, the water's usually pretty calm down there. It's always very clear. You can go out 25, 30 feet deep and still see the bottom. Great to look down there and watch the fish rush up and grab your lure. Here I am in a kind of a poor picture holding what the locals down there call a machete. They're actually a ladyfish. They're found all over the world. And this is a better picture of them here, but they fight really hard. They jump. They're a lot of fun to catch, but they're not good eating. Make very good bait for bigger fish, though. This is a mixed basket from Puerto Lobos, showing the spotted sand bass on the left, a couple of triggerfish, and then a fish called a pargo, which is a snapper. Now, that's a float tube size catch, but they get up to about 50 pounds, and you don't even want to be anywhere near one in a float tube because they'll tear you up or rock you for sure. This is another mixed bag, probably 7 or 8 different species. You can catch up to 25 or 30 different species down there in a day, in which you catch 200 fish altogether. Kind of like Forrest Gump's chocolate box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. This again is a spotted sand bass. They're like largemouths on steroids. Very strong jaws with teeth. And we're using rattle traps down there, silver and blue. And after about 10 of these, the paint was all chewed off, and it was just nothing but a cream-colored lure blank, although they still hit it. Again, another mixed bag. On the left is the sardinera, also known as the cabria, very popular fish all over the Gulf. They get up to 25, 30 pounds, but this is a float tube size. On the far right is a Graysby, which is an interesting looking fish with the vertical bars. Like all the fish down there, they're fun to catch and good to eat. You don't catch too many rooster fish up in the northern part of the Gulf, but you do catch a few small ones on lures. If you want the bigger ones, you've got to go farther south and use live baits like the machetes or mullet, which they call Lisa down there. And if you use anything with bait on it, you're almost sure to catch a shark or two or a stingray. However, you don't want to get those too close to you or your tube because they can do some serious damage with their stinger. One of the prettiest areas to fish along the whole Sea of Cortez is San Carlos. That's down close to Guaymas, which is a big major Mexican port. But this is more of a fishing area, fishing and tourists. This is the prominent landmark that you can see from miles out to sea and for several miles before you actually get to San Carlos. The Mexican word for it is tetas de cabra, which in English means goat tits. Doesn't sound as romantic. We never fished on this side of the bay. This is a protected bay area. We usually went on the other side where the Sea of Cortez was reachable by dirt road going down to the beach. Launch our float tubes on the beach and then go out and fish around the edges of the rocks and whatnot, catch a lot of different species. We also like to fish the coastline out toward Venado Island. Now, this was not only good fishing, but it was very good diving. We would go out there after we had fished and catch some really nice rock scallops and some lobsters. So the only problem is now it's all ringed with expensive homes and you can't even get close to it. I'll have pictures of that a little later. We hiked up the backside of Goat Tits a couple of times to take some pictures down on the surrounding area. This gives you an idea how pretty the beaches are and how pretty and clear the water is. Fishing was fantastic, by the way. You launch out the beach, go out and fish around the rocks. You fish all day and just catch fish after fish after fish of all different species. This was one of our favorite little fishing coves. It was on the far point of San Carlos. Drive up over a hill and down a dirt road and right down to the beach, launch, go out and fish. Okay, it was great while it lasted, but I just checked Google Earth and looks like that area has all been built up with homes now and it's all private. This is what it looks like on Google Earth right now. It's amazing. You can't get anywhere near where we used to fish. And another before and after heartbreaker is, again, when we were up on Goat Tits, shooting down, you could see where they're already starting to develop the area. They had already dredged out the marina area there on the left. And now what it looks like from Google Earth is there's homes built all up around the whole area. The marina is well developed. There's a great big Howard Johnson's up at the top that takes a big part of the beach. But main point is there's nobody that wants to go fishing or diving is going to be able to reach the water unless they've got a lot of money. But if you go north of San Carlos, there's still some open beach area up there that you can launch. This is a spot where we had to park up above the water and hike down a trail to the left down there to get down to the beach. I'm in the green caddis float tube here coming back up with a bag of fish. And this is his and hers float tube being deflated for the trip back home. And we got the fish dumped out where you can see we got a few. And if you look carefully and count them all, there's probably about 7 or 8 different species in there. All of them are fun to catch and good eating. And that pretty much concludes our trip to Mexico. Hope you enjoyed it. Okay, we'll finish up our middle 20 years section on a trip to Louisiana. I had a company I was working for that sent me on a 6-month tour of duty back to New Orleans area. And every weekend, as soon as I could get out of there, I was in my float tube down on the bayous and the canals down in the Plaquemines Parish area, which is south of New Orleans, between Buras and Venice, for anybody that knows the area at all. And I had a lot of places I found down there. I could drive my car right up to the edge of the water and launch the float tube, fish all day and never see another fisherman in a lot of cases. Also fished the boat channels down around Buras. These are some deeper water channels and held a lot of fish. However, most of the best fishing was fishing around the shoreline and casting into the docks and that type of thing, but always caught a lot of fish. Got good redfish, sea trout, a few flounders. Wherever I could find an old oyster loading dock, that was a great place to fish. You can see all the piled up oyster shells along the shore there. That attracted a lot of invertebrates like small crabs and shrimp and other little goodies that fish hunt for, the predator fish. So it was usually pretty good fishing in those areas. And then Mr. Pelican learned to recognize me anytime I was down there. If I caught an undersized fish and just happened to make a sloppy toss that landed near him, he gladly accepted the offering. Now, the locals in the office where I worked down there all thought I was pure crazy. And they used to ask me, what you doing going in that water? There's alligators and snakes out there. Well, okay, I replied in kind. Those gators and snakes, they got to watch out for themselves. I'm going to be fishing. The Holy Trinity of fishing down there are speckled trout, redfish, which are also red drum, and then flounders. They're all fun to catch, they're all good eating, and they all hit the same lures, fished in the same area in the same way. So that's a good day's fishing right there. This is another good day of fishing with a couple of 30 and 33 inch reds in there. Anymore, they've got a slot limit on the reds, and you can't keep them over 27 inches. But not on that day. This is a good catch of speckled sea trout. Small limit on those is 12 inches, but happened to get in a school of good-sized fish that day, and almost all of these are at least 14 to 16 inches. Biggest one's probably about 22 inches, and that's my old green caddis. While I was in New Orleans, TubeDude was still staying at the home back in Tucson, but she came over a couple of times to fish with me, and happened to get there on a cold spell between Christmas and New Year's, so she's all bundled up. Looks like she's in Alaska, not in New Orleans. Did pretty well on the speckled trout that day, though. This is one of the locals from the office down there that finally decided that it'd be worth trying out in the float tube, and that's my big browning on the left, and my catch of fish on the left. That's his on the right. I caught more and bigger fish, but he was very happy with his catch because he had never fished out of a float tube before. I doubt that he bought one, but he had a good time that day. Now, one of the incidental catches you get down there a lot are the blue crab. And sometimes they'll grab the lures that you're bouncing along the bottom for redfish and flounder and all that. And they'll usually hang on to it until you can bring them up and slip a net under them if you want to keep a few to eat. If you want even more to eat, put a piece of fish meat on your jig and drop it down in about 4 to 6 feet of water until you feel something moving away with it. Very slowly reel it up to the top, and the crab will still be hanging on. Slip them under the net, and if you play it right, you can take a dozen crabs home to have for dinner along with the fish that you caught that day. Well, hope you enjoyed your trip to Louisiana. Okay, this will be the last 18 years of my float tubing career. We moved back to Utah in 2004, And there are several of the lakes that we fish on a fairly frequent basis, and our fishing mostly has been out of fat cats the last few years, with brief interludes and a couple of others. And the last couple of years I fished mostly out of my tricked out escape. One of the reservoirs that we like to fish the most from float tubes is Deer Creek. Scenery is always beautiful. Fishing is almost always good. You can usually get a mixed bag. Mixed bag will usually include some perch and trout. Might have smallmouth and walleye along with some perch. On some days maybe all you catch are the trout, but that's not a bad thing because they're good red meat and really good eating out of Deer Creek. There are some browns in Deer Creek. Usually catch those in the colder months of the year. This was late December, just before freeze up. Jordanelle Reservoir is an interesting place. Been a lot of fluctuations in the different species and the populations of different species. DWR's messing around with it a lot, but on any given day it might be good fishing. Used to have some really good smallmouth in there. This is a 21-incher I caught fishing out of my H3 back in the mid-2000s. Although the perch population has declined a bit, you can still catch a few along with some smallmouths. Some days, just like Deer Creek, you've got to settle for a limit of rainbows, and that's not all bad. There are also some nice cutthroats in Jordanelle, although very few people catch them. We've seen them up to 6 pounds in there. Also a lot of browns in Jordanelle. This is about a 22-incher I caught late one November after it had been up in the Provo River doing its spawn thing. Kind of skinny, as you can see, so I got it to pose for a quick picture and sent it back to fatten up a bit. Manaway Reservoir is a little lake that we used to fish an awful lot more than we do now. Used to be we could fish all day and not even see another fisherman. Now you can't go down there without being overrun with the power squadron, and there's been some water quality issues, so we just don't point our float tubes in that direction much anymore. But in the good old days, you used to be able to catch a lot of nice bluegill. You still can. Lots of good perch up to 12-13 inches. And quite a few nice largemouths in there. This is a good average, but they catch them up to 5-6 pounds. They plant rainbows in Manaway, and there's a lot of them in there most of the year. We've caught them up to 19-20 inches out of Manaway. Pineview is another reservoir that has had its day and not as good today as it used to be. The concessionaire wants to charge $20 to launch even a float tube. That's a bit much. When you get out on the lake anytime after about 8 o'clock in the morning, it's overrun with the power squadron wackos that feel it's cool to run up and down the lake drinking beer and towing a water skier and running over float tubers. So we usually wait till first part of October, when they close down the concessions and when all the wacko power squadron guys go home. We get nice mixes of perch and crappie. Perch used to be a lot bigger. That averaged 10 to 12 inches. The past few years they've been smaller. Some nice bluegills in Pineview. And unfortunately there's a whole lot of black bullheads also, and they hit everything you're fishing for the other species. Still good smallmouth in Pineview. Guys that fish for them do well. And the glamour species of Pineview is the tiger muskie. I don't fish for them, but every once in a while I'll hook one on the stuff I'm fishing for the other guys, and I let them play around a little bit and get some exercise before I turn them loose. This is one of my favorite pictures. It was taken by a guy from the Ogden newspaper up by the dam one evening when I was out fishing right at sunset. The sunset had colored the water a nice golden color, so I got this picture and I call it On Golden Pond. Starvation Reservoir is one of our favorite tubing reservoirs. You can launch all around the lake. This is Rabbit Gulch, which is one of our favorite spots. Great to get up there early in the morning and see the nice sunrises. And because of the mixed species in the lake, you never know what you're going to get. There's two babe with Looks like rainbows, walleyes, perch, and maybe a smallmouth or two. Here she is with a nice basket of big perch. Used to be a lot more perch and a lot bigger perch. Been kind of skinny the last few years. Here she is with some nice rainbows, which we also call starvation steelhead because they get big and they jump and cavort and a lot of fun to catch. Up until the mid-2000s, there were a lot of big chubs in starvation. Well, there used to be a lot of chubs overall. And then the smallmouth and the walleyes ate off all the little ones as fast as the big ones could reproduce them, and they all died out gradually, just leaving a few of these big chubosaurs. This is probably the last one that we caught. TubeDude complains that I don't get her best side. Well, here's her shot. You know, she's probably going to shoot me when she sees this shot. Love those starvation steelhead. This is one that's a little over 20 inches. Caught out of my fat cat all tricked out. Here's a starvation mixed bag. Here's another starvation mixed bag of starvation steelhead and perch. A lot of people don't know that there's some good-sized browns in starvation. This is about a 21-incher that I caught and got to pose for a picture before I sent it back to maintain the population. Mix of perch and a walleye, perch and 2 walleyes. There's 5 nice eater walleyes, including one that's over 20 inches. One of the bad things about starvation is the huge tank carp that are in there, and they got no pride at all. They'll hit anything that you fish for the other species, and then you got to play about a half-hour tug-of-war with them if you want to salvage your lure. But they are a lot of fun, and if you got no pride, they're definitely put a bend in your stick. These days I probably fish Utah Lake more than I do any other, except maybe Willard Bay. And I do so because there's a lot of fish in it, and there's some big fish in it, and almost always able to catch something. Here I am launching my fat cat off the rocks at Lincoln Beach late one fall during low water conditions. TubeDude loves Utah Lake because there's a lot of catfish there. She's also known as the kitty queen, besides being known as TubeDude. This is a nice fat one that she got down there Lincoln Beach. Here's a nice one she got over off Linden. Here I am with a couple I kept for the smoker off Lincoln Beach. And this was the first cat I caught one spring. I think it was around the first part of March, still pretty cold. And I was fortunate buddy in a boat came over and took a picture of it for me. Usually don't have anybody there to take a picture when I catch good fish. Had a buddy in a boat that took this picture of me dipping a catfish down off Lincoln Beach out of my tricked out escape. A lot of white bass in Utah Lake. Anybody that's fished Utah Lake at all knows that they're in there thick, and whenever you find them you can catch a grindle. Because they're good eating, we might keep a couple of dozen on occasion. Some years they run bigger than others, and if you can find them at least 10 or 11 inches with good wide shoulders on, big enough for fillets, they're definitely worth keeping and filleting and eating. Now TubeDude not only does well on catfish, but she catches some pretty good walleye too. This is about a 24-incher that she got down at Linden one year. This is a 27-incher off the rocks at Lincoln Beach. This is about a 26-incher I caught out off the bubble up down below Linden. You can see a little hint of a jig in its corner of its mouth. This is what it looks like inside. Took a little jig. I've been fishing for white bass, so it kind of disproves the theory of big bait, big fish. Doesn't always work that way. This is a limit of 6 walleye. Caught quite a few years ago, back when there was no slot limit. Today you can only keep one over 24 inches. And all of these were over 24 inches, and probably caught 20 fish that day that were all that big or bigger. Willard Bay Reservoir is the other reservoir I fish the most these days. This is the North Marina, just coming out early one spring when the snow's receding from the mountains. Here's TubeDude with a mix of cookie cutter catfish, and looks like she's got a crappie or two in there. This is my standard catch, 8 cookie cutter cats. Because the cats are such good eating out of Willard Bay, and we do a lot of family fish fries, we do keep quite a few cats. Here's the day I came in, I had 8 cats in the basket when I started in. When I got in, I only had 5 left because they'd punched a hole in my basket. 3 of them had gotten loose. However, this one was a little fatter and he got stuck in there, so I did salvage a few. Some great crappie in Willard Bay. In some years it goes up and down depending on the water levels and the spawning conditions each year. We do catch them up to 15 inches, so there's some nice fish in there. This is a nice one that TubeDude caught. Limit on crappie in Willard Bay is 10, and when they're really in and on the chew, it doesn't even take you a half hour to get a limit of 10 nice crappie. This is the holy trio of Willard, a wiper, a walleye, and a crappie. Now, caught all 3 of these on the same day, and I only caught 1 of each species, so ended up making a pretty good picture at the end of the day. This is the walleye that appears in the middle of that picture, showing the background conditions. It's cold that day. Used to be a lot more wipers in Willard than there are now, and this used to be about an average 4-pounder, and you could catch 10 or 12 in a day without any problem. But then they lowered the limit on them when the numbers dropped off, and you went from 6 to 3. But we had one day back in the North Marina that we got into a big boil right inside the marina, and TubeDude and I each caught probably 10 or 12 wipers each. This is the 3 I kept. These are the 3 she kept. Here's a catch of 2 nice wipers and a catfish. October, November every year, when the water cools off and the shad start dying, the big perch move in to mop them up out off the marinas, and you can really catch some nice ones. Here's 8 to be 8. Here's 1 less than a dozen. Here's 7 nice perch and a walleye. That made for a good day. Some nice bluegill in Willard. A lot of people don't catch them, but if you fish around the rocks the right way, you will catch some nice bluegill. Also, some really nice smallmouth all around the lake, around the rocks. This is probably a little larger than the average size that you catch, but we do catch them up to 2-3 pounds also. Now, gizzard shad are plentiful in the lake. They're the primary forage species, and they do get big. A lot of people don't know that, and you're not supposed to keep them, but this is one that TubeDude caught on a crappie jig. We took a quick picture of it before releasing it. And this is what the gizzard shad look like after they've been introduced to a wiper. Now, one of the nasty things about Willard is, like a lot of the lakes in Utah, it's full of big carp. They live off the same stuff that the other fish do, so they'll hit the same lures that you're fishing for the other fish. Yuba reservoirs, a water that we used to fish a lot more than we do now because it's gone through so many changes in water levels and species and everything else. When we first came back from Arizona, the lake had been virtually dried up during the drought period, and then DWR planted some rainbows in there to at least provide a fishery, and they grew big and fat on the fathead minnows that were living in the lake without any predators to feed on them. And so we go down and would catch 15, 20 big rainbows in a day, up to 5 or 6 pounds. And ultimately, we saw some up to 8 pounds before the fathead minnow population crashed, and then the big trout population crashed. Used to be some nice, a lot of nice northern pike coming out of Yuba Reservoir. This is one I caught back in between the dam and the road, and see TubeDude in the background. Here's a 2-footer that she got holding in a death grip out off the dam. And after the last big crash, they drained the lake and then they replanted it with some perch. The perch grew fast and got big fast, and for a while they had a moratorium. You couldn't even keep the perch. but then they took the limit off and made it 10. And a limit of 10, 12, 13-inch perch makes a nice basket and a couple of meals. Used to be a lot more walleye in Yuba than there are now. Didn't used to be any problem at all to catch a limit of nice walleyes. And always had a lot of carp in Yuba. This is a mirror carp that took a jig I've been fishing for perch. And that's pretty much the end of the Utah session for the last few years. Thanks for watching. Okay, we've talked about the lakes that we fished the most while we lived in Utah. Now, as promised, this is a follow-up on some of the ones that we've only hit one or two times or don't hit very frequently. And at the end, there's a few of the lakes up in Idaho that we've made the trip up and fished at least once. I like to fish Bear Lake here in Utah a lot more than I do, but I do manage to get up there around the 1st of December some years and fish for the Bonneville whitefish, and really a pretty lake to fish. It's always a fun trip. Here's a few of the Bonneville whitefish after one trip. Here's a nice mac that decided it wanted to eat the same jig that I've been using for the whitefish. Bent my stick a lot more and stretched my string a lot more, and took a lot longer to get into the net than the whitefish did. Ditto for this Bonneville cutthroat. I think it was about an 18, 19 incher. It hit the same jig I'd been using for the whitefish. Blue Lake is over on the Nevada border. You go to Wendover and then south and then back into Utah. It's a warm natural spring lake, and it's full of a lot of weird fish. It's also got some nice bass and bluegill in it. But being a warm lake, it also attracts what we call blue lake carp, divers. But if you get away from them, you can catch some nice bluegill and catch some nice bass. This is kind of a small one. If you really fish for them with the right stuff, you can catch some 4 or 5 pounders over there. And then there's the tilapia, which are one of the exotics in there, which are mandatory keep and kill. That's okay because they're pretty good eating. Echo Reservoir on the Weber River has quite a mix of species. Used to be the standard trout and perch and smallmouth bass, but now they've also got crappie, channel catfish, and even some walleye in there, so you never know what you're going to catch. Here's a mixture of perch, smallmouth, and crappie in the mix. Here's one of the nice average-sized smallmouth that you catch over there. And one of the rainbows. There's also some nice-sized browns in there. Electric Lake up on the skyline used to have nothing but these Colorado River cutthroats in it, but now it probably has more tiger trout than the cutthroats. It's also got a lot of red-side shiners if somebody wants to go over and get a lot of minnows. DMAD Reservoir is on the Sevier River over toward Delta, and most of the year it's a lot higher water and there's multiple species. I happened to get down there late in the fall when it was pretty low and I didn't have a lot of hope for catching a lot, and I didn't, but I did catch some nice goldens. This is one. This is another. Got several of each, but that's all I caught that day were carp and bullheads. Huntington Reservoir, also known as Mammoth, up on the skyline. Beautiful little lake and a great place to fish for some really nice tiger trout. Also some cutthroats in there, but cutthroats are mandatory release as soon as you catch one. Pelican Lake has long been known as one of the best places in Utah to catch nice big bluegills. However, it went into a downward spiral when it got full of carp, and got really nasty, so they poisoned it off the last couple of years, and it's on its way back, hopefully. Used to be some really nice bass in there, too, and we're hoping that they make a comeback. Rockport Reservoir is another reservoir on the Weber River, and standard mix of rainbow trout, brown trout, perch, smallmouth bass. It's a good place to fish when it's up. Right, this is real low water level. I made an exploratory trip over here this last fall. Did end up with a basket of perch and a nice smallmouth. Only made one trip in my life to Salem Pond down past Spanish Fort. Met a couple of guys over there and through plastics caught some nice channel cat and a couple of bass. That's the only time I've ever fished it. Schofield Reservoir is a Utah legacy. Been up and down over the years, and a lot of different species changes and water level changes and this type of thing. But if you hit it right, you can still get some nice fish. Back in the good days, you catch a lot of nice rainbows, a lot of nice cutthroats. For a while, there were a lot of good tiger trout in there too, but not so much anymore. Because of the chub problem, DWR's planted both wipers and tiger muskies in there, and they're coming on strong, and they've reduced the chub problem, so hopefully we'll have a real good fishery again here soon. Went across the border into Idaho. Mackey Reservoir, again, hit it late in the fall one year and looked pretty low. We weren't sure we were going to get anything at all, but we did end up catching a bunch of nice rainbows on spinners. There's one that TubeDude got that's a pretty decent one. Here's a nasty old spawned out kokanee that hit my spinner. That's TubeDude's tube in the background. Magic Reservoir down by Twin Falls can be a really good place to fish for some big rainbows. We got some nice rainbows while we were there. Only dink perch, we didn't catch anything big. Salmon Falls Creek Reservoir is where I probably caught more species in one day than almost any place else I fished. I think we counted 7 species. Several nice rainbows, several nice walleye, several really nice perch. But then in addition, we got lots of nice smallmouth. We got some crappies. We got squawfish, which are now called pike minnows, I guess is the appropriate name for them. I can't remember the other species we got, but there was another one in there somewhere. This is the mixed bag I brought in, about 4 species in there, which are trout, walleye, smallmouth, and perch. Twin Lakes is a popular place for Utahns, just up by Preston, and it's got a multi-species lake also. We got rainbows, we got perch, we got bluegill. What we didn't get were largemouth bass and crappie, and there's some big ones of both in there. Okay, well that about finishes this segment. Hope you liked it. Most people think the term crazy float tuber is a redundancy, that all float tubers are crazy. And they follow me around for a year, they're absolutely sure of it, because I'm usually the first one on the ice after, or first one on the water after the ice comes off, and I'm the last one on the water before it ices up. And it's not because I have an affinity for fishing in the cold, it's just that time of the year is some of the best fishing, both first and last. But be safe, don't be sorry, don't do anything stupid that's going to get you frozen in the ice. We don't want your next of kin to have to chisel your body out, no matter how well preserved you are. First started doing this silly stuff way back on Yuba Reservoir back in December of 1981. And again, it wasn't because we're trying to prove how tough we were. It's just that Yuba was kicking out a lot of nice fish in those days. And big perch, big walleye, big northern pike, and they were all biting well before the ice came on the lake. Here's a partial results of that day's trip. Got a 38-inch northern pike and a bucket full of nice walleyes from about 4 pounds to 8 pounds. On the other side of the car, there's a basket full of big perch that go up to 15, 16 inches. So it was definitely a good day and worth braving the cold. Here's a few shots on Deer Creek Reservoir back in January 2017. It's one of those years when Deer Creek didn't freeze over. I'm illustrating here how to lower your float tube down hard-packed snow and ice without falling butt over tea kettle by trying to carry it down. Once it's in the water, it's a lot easier to get in and go fishing. And after a full day of fishing, you can bring it back in and look around and find a nice picture, take a picture, and go home. Not sure what was in the basket on the fish, but I'm sure I caught fish. Almost always do in the winter. Here I am tube sledding the tube back rather than kicking my way back in the float tube on the water. Because there's a good PVC coating on those fat cats, they glide over the ice very well. Great fishing during the winter on Deer Creek. Usually a lot of nice rainbows you can catch on bubble and fly. You can catch them on spinners, shallow running crankbaits. Good time for big rainbows. Unfortunately, you catch a lot of finless freddies in there too that haven't been in the lake long enough to grow their fins. If you fish in 40 to 60 feet of water, you might even find a nice school of perch and a few stray walleyes this time of the year. I've caught bigger ones, but I just don't have any pictures, of course. Another thing about fishing in the cool months on Deer Creek is you're more liable to catch the browns up there than you are during the summer. So that's a rare bonus. Here's a few pictures on Utah Lake Lincoln Beach back in December 2008. There'd been a fresh snowfall, so I wimped out and didn't drive down to where I wanted to launch the float tube. I went tube sledding. Here I am about halfway down. Here I am ready to launch in the cold water off the rocks. Didn't get out there very long before a squall started coming across the lake, and I wimped out and got off the water. At least it wasn't a skunk day. I got a few white bass. Here's a few shots at Willard Bay Reservoir in February 2018. This is one of the rare years that the whole inlet channel opened up a ways out into the lake by the middle of February. And so, having done well there in the past before under similar conditions, I drove down and found a gate across the road for no vehicle access. So I put my tube card on, slipped it under the gate, trucked my way down to the marina. First I had to go under the cable, and then the rest of the way down. I got down and the ramp was not usable, so I had to go up and over the dike, launch my float tube in the open water on the other side. Now that was a lot of fun with fins on. Notice the tube cart stashed in the front of the float tube. Had a good day on the water. Probably caught over 20 catfish. They didn't fight as hard as they normally would in warm water, but they were fish, and had a bunch for a good fish fry. On the way back, I didn't even bother putting the cart on it. I just tube sledded it all the way back. Worked just fine. Made it to the car, made it home. I've also fished the Willard Bay North Marina during the times of the year when the lake is open, but it keeps skimming up overnight in the cold in the marina. So you get down the marina and you find out that what was open yesterday afternoon is now skim ice. You've got two choices. You can go home or you can break your way out through the ice. Now, if it's only an 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, you've got a shot. If it's any thicker than that, then that's pretty tough. Here I am breaking my way out through the ice and tube babe following along. Here's another case where the ice was too thick to break with a float tube, but I was walking along the shoreline, walking on top of the ice and breaking it as I went, pulling the tube behind me, trying hard not to fall on my behind on that slick ice. Have to tell you, I wasn't always successful. This is a trip down to the South Marina during Thanksgiving one year. It had frozen and then partially thawed. And so I was down there fishing, waiting for the turkey to get cooked, and thankful that I caught this walleye. If you really want some nice tiger trout fishing, go up to Huntington Reservoir between the time that the snow falls and that the ice settles in on the lake. Really catch some nice fish up there at that time. If you want to become a cool tuber, there are some suggestions. First and foremost, dress for comfort. You need to dress in layers, and you need to wear good thermal stuff, shirts, pants, and socks. There's a lot of high-tech new stuff that's available that really works well. Wear a good coat and hat. That's where you lose most of your heat, is on the top part when you're float tubing. And if you've got good ice fishing gear, that's a good place to start. Wear gloves, wool or neoprene or both. It's not bad to have an extra pair along, and just depends on how wimpy you are and what you need. Hand warmers, those little catalytic things that you take out of the cover and they start warming up. Those are great to either slip inside your gloves or put in a pocket where you can just put your hands in occasionally to warm them up if you need them. Most importantly, avoid constriction, especially on your feet. As your feet get cold, you're done. And let's work backwards. You need a large enough foot pocket fin to accommodate not only your neoprene waders, but a pair of neoprene booties with a hard sole that you can walk on hard surfaces. And sometimes you have to get the lace-up fins in order to be able to put all that stuff on. You have to work backwards. You might even want to take your waders and booties down with you when you go to buy the fins to make sure you can get the good ones. Avoid liquids. Don't drink a lot the night before or during the morning that you're going out fishing. What goes in must come out, and that's accelerated by cold water. Do carry some energy snacks. Carry some candy bars, some energy bars, whatever you need to occasionally give your energy a little boost and keep the heat up. And lastly, as suggested up front, be cool, not cold. Don't do anything stupid. Well, that's it.